Well, good morning, church. It is good to see all of you here this morning. A lot of visitors in for the holiday, and I just want to take a moment to express how grateful we are to have you today, that you're an honored guest, and that we hope you come to know the love of God a little better by your time with us this morning. Well, and if you're visiting with us, I'd like to just quickly point out that we don't normally have a big table full of crackers and socks up front. This is our first week of getting started to collect donations to create blessing bags to hand out to people experiencing homelessness in our communities. And because we put the welcome desk in that I hope a lot of you got to utilize today, we're trying to find new areas for other things that we're doing, constantly going on here in our church. We thought, there's no better way to express that we are trying to get together as a church, we are trying to be the church, than to have our offerings clearly up front, to remind us that what we do and who we are as the Church of Christ is not just contained within these walls, but branches out further in our community. It's a good reminder for us as we sit in the pews this morning. Yeah, absolutely. On top of that, I'm really excited. I know it's been mentioned. I'm really excited for our young people who are going to be leaving for church camp in just a couple hours. Camp was a very important in my personal spiritual formation as a young person. And I guess I shouldn't say young person because I went for the ages of 5 when my dad was directing his own week at camp till I think right around 26 or 27 when y'all made me be the preacher and I couldn't go anymore. It's been huge for me. It's where I led my first devotional, and being unprepared for that's the reason I have full-page manuscripts to preach from today. It's where I deepened my love of God and found lifelong friends in the faith. But one of the things that makes camp so successful in my mind is that it's away from everyday life. It's completely away. There's no distractions from your household friends. It's fantastic because they have no internet service or no phone service, no internet, no rides to town. There's nothing for you to do than just simply be present at this church camp where you're focusing on God. And you're no longer in your comfort zone. You no longer have these distractions. And it's very appropriate, with just thinking about this metaphorical isolation, it's really appropriate that it happens in rustic cabins and in the middle of the woods and stuff like that. Not only are they in the metaphorical wilderness, but they're in the literal wilderness as well. And we know from the Bible that when the people of God enter into the wilderness, great things can happen. Great things can happen. Now, just because great things can happen when we enter into the wilderness does not always necessarily mean it will be easy to enter into the wilderness. While the wilderness of church camp might be a very pleasant experience, unless they stick you in the cabin of 13-year-old boys for 3 years, which was my time. While it's usually a very easy and pleasant experience, the wilderness in the Bible stories are usually much more challenging than that. Going through the wild places in the ancient world was really a pretty dangerous task. They risked the lack of food or water. They were susceptible to the elements, to the animals, and so much more. You could generally, I think, sum up going through the wilderness in the ancient world by saying it is an experience of solitude, scarcity, and struggle. Solitude, scarcity, and struggle. You'd be completely alone with no one else to count on, no cars to drive in and pick you up, no services to be delivered by drones or whatever. And you had very little resources to utilize on your journey, and you'd be faced with all these potential difficulties. Going through the wilderness, especially in the biblical examples, was always this crucible type experience where you were pushed to the limit to see what you're really made of, and in the scriptures, how strong your faith to God really was. And that's really going to be the main point of our lesson today. What do we think about God in our wilderness experiences? And how do we engage with Him through it all? All through our lives, we are faced with seasons where we travel through the wilderness, are we not? Where we face solitude, scarcity, or struggle. Maybe you've been let go from work and you don't know who's going to pay the next bills. Maybe it's a season of anxiety or depression. Maybe it's a difficult, painful surgery you've had to endure and are continuing to recover from. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one. Part of life is being periodically thrust out into the wilderness. It's a dark, difficult time, and as we suffer through them, our thoughts about God are generally going to be all over the place, aren't they? Whenever we go through these hard times, we wonder why God might be letting this happen. We wonder why he doesn't do more. We wonder what's it's going to look like when we reach the other side. And we're not the first people to ask those questions, are we? We're not the first people to ask those questions as we enter into these metaphorical wildernesses. And so I want us to spend some time this morning listening to these Bible stories where God's people journey through the metaphorical and the literal wilderness and see what they do and see what the Bible instructs us as we go through these difficult times. Now, obviously Israel faced the wilderness, literal and metaphorical, quite a number of times, but the one that I'm particularly drawn to this morning is their journey in Exodus 15 through 18. Because right before this time of solitude, scarcity, and struggle, they've just been rescued out of slavery, right? If you think back to Exodus 14 and 15, God stepped in, he raised up a leader, he rained plagues down on their oppressors, and he rescued them from the most unlikely circumstance out there. Israel was at their highest high, their highest peak. And the first half of chapter 15 it's huge, listing praises and songs to God. Moses is leading them, Miriam is leading them in songs of worship to God to thank him for what he had done. But yet before the chapter is even over, we start to see the toil that the wilderness can take on their faith before the chapter is even over. So we're going to start this morning right after those songs of praise in Exodus 15, 22 and on. It reads, "Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding any water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah, which means bitterness. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What are we to drink?' Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, 'If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commandments and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you.'" Now, what we see here in this short episode of trial and testing in the wilderness is the people here they're without any water. They've been traveling for 3 days and they're starting to complain. And to be completely honest, I'm not sure this complaint issue there in verse 24 is really supposed to be viewed all that negatively, which might sound contrary. I don't think it's supposed to be viewed all that negatively. Now, in chapter 16 and 17, they start complaining a whole lot more and more aggressively and more disrespectfully, and I have no doubt that that is supposed to be viewed in a negative light. But really, in this moment, God has an opportunity to provide for his people. You know, they're understandably concerned that they haven't had water in 3 days. 3 days. And then they finally arrive at this body of water, and they stoop down to drink it and realize they couldn't. And you can imagine the frustrations that would come up in that scarcity. But even still, God shows his people that he will provide a way in what seems like the impossible. You know, and from this act of provision, God is able to invite them into a relationship of obedience and care. Now, it's 4th of July coming up. We're good old Americans. We don't like being told what to do. We don't like having a bunch of rules or statutes or instructions, any of that. We kind of started a war over it a while back to get out of some of that. But this statute from God is given in a very positive light. This is not the words of some dictator, not the words of some boss, not even the words really of a judge in this moment, but the words of their healer. It says he is the one who heals them. Other translations will say, "I am the Lord, your healer." In short, God is saying, hey, listen to me, follow me, and you will be cared for. If you listen, if you follow, you will be cared for. And it's that invitation early in their journey that is meant to set a tone, right? To set a path for them as they continue on in the wilderness. They would know how they should move forward. To say, yeah, the journey ahead is going to be hard. You may have doubts, you may have questions, but if you stick with me, everything truly will be okay. But to that point, there is still wilderness before them, right? Another 2 chapters, really 3, I think 18's included there. 3 more chapters of wilderness before them. In the next chapter, they're desperate for food. They complain. They even mention that they wish they could return back to their slavery in Egypt so at least they could die with full bellies. Okay? And obviously such comments would be horrendously offensive to the God who had done so much to save them from their oppressors. But you see, it's just a result of the difficulties they see in the wilderness. They know that. That wasn't that long ago that they had been in slavery. And yet, as they travel through the wilderness, their mind shifts to the negative and they desire things that are even worse for them because they feel lost and they feel that scarcity and they feel that solitude and they feel that struggle. But even still, God provides for them. Then in the next chapter, they're low on water again, and their complaints, they kind of reach new lows as they start to question if God is even really with them or not. Yet God provides for them. Then they're attacked by a local army. Now remember, these are a bunch of recently freed slaves, okay? You don't teach your slaves how to fight because you don't want them to fight back. They didn't have a stockpile of weapons, so their chances to win against this well-trained army of a nearby nation was practically zero. And yet God steps in and provides deliverance for them. In each of these episodes, these chapters, we see trial and deliverance. We see complaint and provision. But throughout these chapters, if you're reading them on your own, there's this word that keeps coming up. It comes up in 15, it comes up in 16, it comes up in 17. And that's the word test. Testing them. At one point it says testing God. Part of the hardships of the wilderness journey are purposed for the sake of God testing our faith. Now, kind of like rule, right? Testing has a bit of a negative connotation in our culture, in our world these days. We hear that God is testing our faith, and we immediately think that He's intentionally trying to drop us in a situation where we're going to sink or swim. That He doesn't maybe care if we get a failing grade and lose everything just because He wants to test us and see where we stand. But that's not what testing means here in these chapters. Testing should really be understood through these narratives as training. I think is the better word, training. These encounters are not meant to make us fail, not meant to make us sink, but instead to make us lean more heavily on the only one who can truly carry us through the struggles of the desert places, right? It's not about making you fail, losing your faith, losing your salvation, any of that. No, it's about causing you to lean on the God who can carry you through it. God delivered Israel when they were trapped between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea and thought there was no way out. God delivered Israel when they were thirsty with nothing to drink. God delivered Israel when they were starving. And yet each time that happened, Israel should have began to deepen their faith and their trust in God to save them, right? When you're there between the army and you see and you think it's all over, but God provides. When you think you're going to starve and God provides. When you think you're going to die of thirst and God provides. The next time you face those harsh struggles, you should have more of an expectation to trust in God through it. Because in the wilderness, the wilderness of solitude, scarcity, and struggle, God is a God of presence, provision, and power. Okay? He is the God of presence, provision, and power. Think back with me, if you will, to a time like you felt like you were in the wilderness. Just consider this for a moment. A time in your life when you felt like you were walking through the wilderness. And consider with me how God helped deliver you through that time. Where was God in that moment, in that season of your life? Maybe it wasn't some miraculously obvious action by God, like talking to Moses. And if not, and it probably wasn't, what are the subtle ways that God was there to help you? Was it through the scriptures? Was it through other Christians encouraging you? Was it through therapy? Was it through just God slowly and gently giving you a new sense of peace to move you out and help you move on? The point is that in one way or another, God was offering presence, provision, and power in your darkest night, right? Whether He was obvious or subtle, God was there offering presence, provision, and power in the midst of solitude, scarcity, and struggle. He never leaves us. And it's in remembering those times of overcoming, remembering that we got through it, remembering that God was there, that we should start to strengthen our souls so that when we come into a new wilderness, whether it be today or tomorrow, we have a better understanding of where God might be at work. It's easy to complain when we're in the wilderness, easy to question God, easy to be fearful or angry. And God can handle that. You've heard me say this over and over again, right? That God can handle that. He can handle your questions, your fear, your anxiety, whatever it might be. We don't see God getting angry at the Israelites for their grumbling here in chapter 15. But still, while the turmoil might come easy to us in those dark nights, we can remember how God has provided light in the past, provided rescue in the past, and lean into that to develop the trust, to develop the peace and understanding, right? We're being trained, not tested, trained for a stronger faith. Therefore, we should display that stronger faith in the next valley. As you come out of one valley and you enter into a new one as life goes, we should embrace that valley stronger than we did the last. Until that day where valleys will be no more and God has sealed it all, and there will be no more pain and no more wildernesses. Now, I kind of understand writing this. Some of you may still be wondering if these trials, valleys, wildernesses, whatever, whether they're the work of Satan or of God. Because we typically attribute this to Satan, right? We're going through a hard time in our life. We say that Satan is tempting us. We're saying that Satan is attacking us. And now I'm up here preaching that God is testing us. And so it can cause a bit of confusion there. What do we do with this seemingly mutually exclusive understanding? Well, there's another New Testament story of passing through the wilderness that not only makes that point here and answers that question, but it helps us. And that's Jesus' temptation through the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4. Interesting enough, I love this little tidbit. It's a bit of a rabbit trail for us here. But interesting little tidbit here. Matthew tells the story of Jesus in a way that directly reflects the story of Israel, right? Matthew is our very Jewish-oriented gospel writer. He is writing especially to the Jewish people. And so as he tells the story of Jesus, it directly reflects the story of Israel. In Exodus, we have the killing of a bunch of baby boys by the hand of a dictator when Israel is in Egypt, right? And then in Matthew's gospel, we have the story of King Herod killing all the baby boys, and Jesus escapes as a refugee down into Egypt. In Exodus, Israel comes out of the Red Sea, through the waters of the Red Sea towards salvation, and is then called the firstborn of God. In Matthew, we have Jesus going through the saving waters of baptism, and he comes out and this voice breaks out from the heavens saying, "You are my son." In Exodus, Israel is led through the wilderness to be tested, and they arrive at Mount Sinai to get the new law from God. And in Matthew, Jesus goes from the waters into the desert to be tested, and then goes to the Sermon on the Mount to deliver the new law of God. Isn't that neat? I really enjoyed that. And so we see here that in chapter 4, it's a reflection of Israel's wilderness journey. Their testing. And now it's being done by the man who will fulfill everything that Israel was supposed to be. And many know this story, and I'm just going to read one quick verse to make our point here. Matthew 4:1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Isn't that interesting? They both show up there, don't they? It says that the Spirit led him, but Satan tested him. Well, and so tempted and tested is literally the exact same word in Greek, right? Especially here. And to clarify, what I think we see here is that God leads his people towards the good. God is leading you on a path towards the good, but sometimes that path of good is going to enter into the wilderness. And when we reach the wilderness, Satan is primed to attack us and to throw us off that ultimately good path, right? God never said it would be easy. The path of God sometimes leads us through wilderness. And then when we enter into that, Satan is primed to attack us and throw us off the good path. And, sometimes God intervenes. Sometimes God intervenes and prevents that evil from Satan, but God doesn't always necessarily stop Satan from his ill-willed actions, does he? At the same time, I think God takes Satan's evil and uses it to his own advantage to strengthen our faiths. If God always prevented Satan's attacks on our faith would ultimately be pretty shallow, wouldn't it? And at the same time, it would be a shallow relationship with God himself. Kind of like how a tree that never has to face the wind for one reason or another grows shallow roots. A faith that is never tested, that never endures trials, never really deepens their roots. Does that make sense? James 1, to kind of continue on this question of God or Satan, James 1 tells us that God does not ever tempt us. That only comes from Satan. But he also says in the very same chapter, and I appreciate Ben reading this for us this morning, that the trials we face pushes our faith towards maturity, towards perfection, it even says. So no, God is not the source of your solitude, scarcity, and struggle. God is not the source of your solitude, scarcity, or struggle. But sometimes he may allow you to experience those things so that we can then learn to trust in his presence, provision, and power. And we can trust that those experiences are worth it because it leads us to grasp tighter the most important thing in all the world, in all time, the love of God. Through that, we grasp tighter the love of God. Folks, the wildernesses in our life, they will come and they will go. The question is, how will we navigate the wilderness? How will we travel through it? With fear and resentment, or with trust and with peace? And maybe the bigger question is, how will we be changed for the better on the other side? When we're out of the wilderness, will we be better or worse than when we entered into it? I can only speak for me. And for me, I choose to trust the one who is willing to enter the wilderness that he never deserved. The one who never had to enter a wilderness, but he did so that you and I would know that we need not be afraid in our own wildernesses, because he has been there and is there with us. If you're here this morning and you're right in the heart of the dark woods or the dry desert, we as a church would love to offer you prayers to help you through that. Or if you don't know this great healer, as chapter 15 in Exodus said, we would love to introduce you to him and help you commit your life to him through baptism today. If that's you this morning in either way, we invite you to come forward for prayers as we stand and as we sing.